Hi everyone, thank you for joining and welcome to the State of SharePoint Security. In this session we are going to discuss, basically everything around SharePoint security, latest news and threats for both SharePoint on-prem and online, so I hope this will be useful for you, and let's begin. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Ivan Vagunin. I am a senior software architect at Tieto-Evry and an independent security researcher. I have been working with SharePoint for more than 10 years in different kind of roles like developer, architect, consultant, and so on. I am a Microsoft Certified Solution Master for SharePoint and Certified Information System Security Professional. Check out my cool badges and follow me on Twitter. I would like to start the session with a little story, a story of a failed security audit. So back in time, we had a client who was running SharePoint 2013, which is, by the way, the best SharePoint version ever. Anyway, our team was supporting and maintaining a legacy solution on top of SharePoint and doing some small-scale development for a few years. And then client decided to go for an external security audit. They ordered an audit from one of well-known consulting companies here in Finland. And of course, I was prepared for some objective critics as we are talking about legacy solution, but the result of audit was nothing I expected. And let's see what kind of main risk did auditor pointed out. So that was the main risk in audit report. It's not exact wording though, but idea is that the farm was so outdated that basically anyone could hack into it and do whatever they want. Though it was true that the farm wasn't updated maybe like for 2 years for a reason, but still I felt like this statement was a bit too much. First, keep in mind that it was a few years ago, and at that point in time it was almost impossible to find SharePoint exploit online. The situation has changed recently and we'll discuss that a bit later. To my best knowledge, there were no SharePoint vulnerabilities which would allow a low privileged user to get excessive access to the farm. And in our case, untrusted users, which were the main threat, they did not have privileges higher than reader. But it also made me wondering what it takes to get an authorized access to data in SharePoint, what kind of pre-existing conditions would be there to use those exploits, how long you can keep your farm unpatched before getting hacked, is there some mitigations that you could do as a preventive measures. So in this session, we'll try to find answers to those questions. To find out the real state of security for our SharePoint deployments, in this session, we'll go through 4 main pieces. First, we'll go through existing SharePoint vulnerabilities and we'll find out what kind of security issues were ever discovered for SharePoint. Then we'll look through SharePoint security model and we'll try to understand how SharePoint protects data from unauthorized access. We'll go through real-world exploitations and see how those SharePoint security mechanisms were bypassed in real life. And we'll talk about possible extra mitigations, what we could do to prevent those attacks from happening. Let's start by finding out what kind of vulnerabilities were ever discovered for SharePoint and what attackers could possibly use to hack into our SharePoint farms. For this, we will refer to CVEs, and if you are not familiar with the term, CVE stands for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, and practically it means that someone has discovered a security issue in a product, and this issue became known to a product developer, and they fixed it and released some public information on the issue and the fix, of course. There are few CVE databases available online, but in our case, as we are talking about SharePoint, we will refer to Microsoft Secure Response Center portal. On the portal, you can find information about all security issues reported for Microsoft products since 2016. And it's not like there were no issues before 2016, it's just there is no data available. For each issue, you'll find a brief description, severity, list of affected product, and of course links to security patches. And also Portal has API, and you can use it to scrape all the data and analyze it, and so did I. And let's see what kind of security issues were discovered and reported for SharePoint. So since 2016, there were around 400 vulnerabilities discovered and reported for SharePoint, and most of them were either important or critical, and we have just a little amount of moderate, but it may be because people just don't like to report moderate ones. And if we break by vulnerability type, we can see that most of issues were attributed as remote code execution, and we also have spoofing and elevation of privilege. But it may not be immediately understandable how those type of vulnerabilities could affect SharePoint and what attacker could achieve by doing so. So we'll try to find out that later. One thing to notice that if we break by product type, we don't really get much insights. Well, it probably because Microsoft doesn't have strict policies on naming its own product, and we can see some issues may be attributed to word automation services and some to SharePoint 2013 Foundation Service Pack 1. One thing to understand here is that vulnerabilities discovered in earlier versions of SharePoint, like for example 2010, they are likely to be inherited in later version, like 16 before they get fixes. So it kind of makes sense that most of reported vulnerabilities were for 2016, and after they were fixed they are not inherited in 2019, and that's why 2019 has much less amount of vulnerabilities in that graphic. To understand how those vulnerabilities could be exploited in your SharePoint farms, first we would need to have some common understanding of SharePoint security model, how SharePoint is supposed to prevent those attacks and stop unauthorized access to your data. And here we come to a little bit of a SharePoint threat modeling. On a very high level, threat modeling includes three main pieces. First one is attacker, some bad guy who is after our asset, which is data in our case. And between those we have a software system, which is SharePoint, and SharePoint is supposed to stop attacker from getting to data they are not supposed to. So let's see how SharePoint authorizes access to data. As you may know, data in SharePoint is contained in a highly structured hierarchy, and the access control system is quite sophisticated. Permission can be granted at different levels and in different scopes. So if we start from the very bottom, we can grant permissions to small pieces of information like items, lists, and then we go to webs and site collections. And on the top of that, we will have a tenant administrator who can manage like multiple site collections. Highest privilege we can get in SharePoint is a farm administrator. Privilege of farm administrator, it spans across multiple tenants. Let's see how it works from attacker perspective. Assuming I start as some low privileged user, for example, I am a reader of some web, but I want to get a data which I cannot get with my current privilege level, because maybe access to that data is only granted to some small group of privileged user. What I will try to do, I will try to escalate my privileges, for example, to get a site collection admin privilege, and then I can grant myself permissions to all the data I want inside the site collection. And this is what's called a vertical privilege escalation, when attacker will try to escalate their privileges from some lower scope to a higher, from some lower level to a higher level. But also there is another path of escalation which is less obvious, and that's what makes it more dangerous. And let's assume as an attacker I already have enough privilege in some scope. Well, what is enough in this case? Anyway, let's assume I'm a tenant admin of some SharePoint online tenant, but what I really want to get is data from another tenant in SharePoint online. So in this case, I would need to exploit some vulnerability which would allow me to jump out of my scope and get data or extract data from another scope, which is another tenant. So that is what called horizontal privilege escalation. Now to elevate in any direction, either vertical or horizontal, I would need to exploit some vulnerability, because normally this kind of behavior is not allowed and should be stopped by SharePoint. But if there is some vulnerability which will allow me to bypass those restrictions put by SharePoint, I could achieve something. So let's see what kind of vulnerabilities are available for the privilege escalation. First one, cross-site scripting is a very popular web attack which have been around for a long time. And in this kind of attack, attacker will try to execute a script against target in the context of another user to get a privilege of that user and get data that user owns. I think in Microsoft term, this kind of attack is usually attributed either as elevation of privilege or spoofing, because that's what it is. Also, since this attack is well known, there are quite a lot of effective mitigations against this kind of attack. And the first one would be a same origin policy implemented by browser, which will prevent scripts running in one origin from accessing data in another origin. In terms of SharePoint, it means that if you run a JavaScript on your own my site, the script won't be able to access data in context of another main tenant site collection or tenant admin center. So attack surface is really limited to a single origin. Also, most likely, this kind of attack will require a higher level of privileges to be executed. In SharePoint, you would normally need to have an owner or designer privileges, so even contributor will not be enough to inject a JavaScript into a web page. So unless attacker finds some smart way to inject a JavaScript with a low privilege, quite good mitigation is to keep permissions of untrusted user as low as possible. For example, reader, or even better, limited reader. So those users will not be able to mess with the web pages, and they will not be able to execute cross-site scripting against your web applications. Another thing to notice is that in the context of SharePoint, cross-site scripting can only elevate as high as site collection admin, because tenant admin permissions can be only granted in the context of tenant admin site. Also, unless you browse a web page with some really high privileged account like SharePoint farm admin, which you should really not be doing, because farm admin is a kind of account which only supposed to be used in some maintenance operations, not like in everyday browsing. So injected scripts, they can be executed in the context of farm admin account and get that high privileges. Next one is security feature bypass, and we have seen little amount of that kind of vulnerabilities reported for SharePoint, but they may be particularly interesting. First, its name doesn't say much or anything, but what it implies is that attacker can find a way to bypass SharePoint access control system and execute actions they were never supposed to execute, but the scope of that actions they always depends. As an example, I can tell you about one security issue I have discovered in SharePoint a few years back. Issue was that a normal user could install an add-in on their own my site, and then they could grant tenant admin permissions to those add-ins without being like tenant admins themselves. So apparently there was some issue in add-in permission consent functionality, and it effectively led to a situation where every user with my site could become a tenant admin just because they could. So this kind of issues can elevate up to tenant admin, as I mentioned, and I'm not aware of any kind of these issues which could elevate any higher to farm administrator, for example, or farm account. And unfortunately, there is not much you could do to mitigate against those, because those are really some bugs in SharePoint functionality itself. The only effective mitigation would be to update in this case. And the last way to escalate privileges in SharePoint we are going to discuss in this session will be remote code execution vulnerabilities. As you can see, there are quite a few of those type of vulnerabilities reported for SharePoint. And what it means that attacker will be able to run some code on a SharePoint server, and it is usually done by sending some special HTTP web request to a SharePoint web application. And once that request is received and processed by SharePoint, SharePoint will execute code in the context of SharePoint farm or in the context of SharePoint application pool, which are still quite powerful SharePoint service account, and it will likely to have data to almost all SharePoint databases. Also, attacker could use local privileges of exploited account to compromise the whole SharePoint server and spread the attack from that server to other part of your network. So this kind of vulnerabilities are quite dangerous. They are always attributed as critical by Microsoft Secure Response Center. Let's see what we could do to protect against those or to mitigate consequences of that kind of attacks. First, the good news is to run the code to execute the remote web request against SharePoint application. Attacker would first need to be authenticated because fortunately there are no unauthenticated remote code executions in SharePoint discovered yet. Then to run this kind of attack, it usually will require some kind of pre-existing configuration state to exist in SharePoint, and that kind of configuration it's not likely to be in place in a modern SharePoint site. So as an example, there were quite a lot of remote code execution discovered in, for example, Excel services for SharePoint or other Office web apps, but well, who uses them nowadays? So practically, if you don't do any kind of weird configurations in SharePoint, like activating some legacy features, using some legacy weird web parts, you might be safe from those attacks. Please note that this still will be critical for multi-tenant SharePoint farms, like for example SharePoint Online, where a user can register a tenant and get tenant admin privileges. Then with this kind of privileges, user can do whatever configurations they want, and then they will be able to exploit a remote code execution against their own misconfigured tenant, and by doing so they will be able to escalate horizontally and get data from all other tenants in the same web application. So a few other mitigation would include just first try to keep untrusted users away from your farm, because well, SharePoint is a place where coworkers, trusted coworkers should just collaborate and have fun and not execute some weird web requests, right? Then if you're running on-prem farm, try to keep local privileges of SharePoint service account to minimum. You don't want to grant excessive local permissions because it will probably make it easy to compromise the whole SharePoint host in case of a remote code execution attack. And just don't do any kind of weird configuration. And if you have some unused service applications, try to just reduce surface attack by deleting unused ones. And of course, keep your patch level up to date, and that might be the most effective way to protect against remote code executions in your SharePoint. Alright, so I think that's enough of theory, and let's get back to the real world and let's see what kind of SharePoint vulnerabilities and how they were exploited in the real world hacks. Let's take just a brief look at list of top 10 most exploited security issues. The article was recently published by 0 Day. There is the URL here, go and read full article if you're interested. For our discussion, it is more interesting that 7 out of 10 most exploited vulnerabilities are around Microsoft product. So what we can notice on this list is that SharePoint finally made it with CVE 2019-0604. That's a good news for us, right? Why this CVE is so popular and what it is about, let's see in next demo. CVE 2019-0604 is a remote code execution vulnerability in business data connectivity functionality of SharePoint. It originates from a well-known issue with deserialization of untrusted user input in .NET, but why does it stand out among other RCAs in SharePoint? And we have seen that there were quite a few of RCAs discovered in SharePoint. Well, I think there are a few reasons for that. First, exploitation of CVE doesn't require much in terms of pre-existing condition. You should only have a reader access to unpatched farm. It doesn't require any special configurations or services to be provisioned, so it can be exploited in default SharePoint configuration. Remember, in the beginning I said that few years back it was hard to find an exploit for SharePoint? Well, the situation has changed with this CVE. Alright, let's see how it works in practice. So here I have my unpatched SharePoint 2019 farm, and I am logged on with accounts that have only reader privileges. So first I would need to check if I have an access to a picker.aspx page, which is an application page of SharePoint. Yep, it seems that I do have access, and basically it's well expected because everyone in a reader or higher role would have access to all application pages in SharePoint web application. So now to exploit the CVE I would need to send a special web request to this page, and for that I will use Fiddler. I will just capture a normal post request to the page, and then I open Fiddler and I will modify request a bit. I will inject my payload, and if this payload is executed successfully, it will just run a new calculator on SharePoint server just for test. So let's see how it will work. Here I have another remote desktop session open to SharePoint server with admin account, so we can see all the processes running on SharePoint server. So now if we execute our crafted web request, how do I do that? Yep, execute. Let's give it a time. Yep, and fair enough, now we can see our new calc process running. Let's check the context. The process is executed under web application pool account, so it will get all the privileges of this SharePoint service account. Well, basically it means that just having a reader privilege, I could run like any code on SharePoint server in a context of web application pool account. The first real-world exploitation of CVE 2019-0604, at least the one that we know about, happened in April 2019, and it was hack of a Middle East governmental organization. Attackers exploited this CVE and got access to SharePoint servers, and from there they compromised other part of governmental networks by using another exploits for some older Windows vulnerabilities. So in this case we can see that not only SharePoint servers were not updated, but also underlying Windows servers probably were not updated, which allowed attackers to propagate across the network and get all of the data out of it. There were a lot of discussion around this attack in spring of 2019 in SharePoint and in security communities online, but did it really teach us anything? Well, apparently not much, because later, same year, 2 months later, there were similar hack happening in United Nations servers, and attackers were able to exploit the unpatched SharePoint server, same vulnerability, and they were able to propagate this attack further and get domain administrator privileges in domain and get data affecting like thousands of users. If this case doesn't teach you to patch your SharePoint farm, I'm not sure I can, so I'll go. Just kidding, I'm not going anywhere actually. Please update. If you did not update since spring 2019, please go and update right now, like right now. So finally, let's revisit some defense and mitigation techniques that I have already mentioned in this session. And also let's try to find out an answer for a hard question: which SharePoint is more secure, online or on-prem? I hope I could convince you that patch management is really the key to your SharePoint security, and you have You should have patch management that makes sense. I know that patch management is hard in SharePoint and it's practically impossible to update your SharePoint farms every month, but at least try to keep up with what's being released in security, fixes in security patches, and if you see that there are some critical issues getting fixed, issues that might be applicable to your SharePoint deployment, please go and update as soon as possible. Second one, always follow the least privilege principle. It applies both to user account and to SharePoint service account. So just grant as much permissions or as little permissions to user as they only need to do their work. Don't grant excessive permission, and same applies to SharePoint service account. Don't grant too much of local permissions to service account like farm account and application pool, and that will make it a bit more difficult to compromise your SharePoint infrastructure. Follow other defense in-depth techniques like network isolation, deploy some IDS or intrusion prevention system if you can. Also, as a last resort in protecting your data might be encryption. So if you need to put some really confidential data in SharePoint, and I want to emphasize that really confidential data doesn't belong to SharePoint, but if you have to put something really sensitive like credential information, for example, before you put it in SharePoint, you better encrypt it and keep your encryption key somewhere else. So in case that data will be instructed from SharePoint as a result of some attack, well, attacker will not get just enough. And now the hard question, what kind of SharePoint should you choose from security perspective? Is it on-prem or is it online? Which one is more secure? Should you keep your data on your own or should you trust Microsoft to do so? To answer that, let's try to compare risks which are specific to both options side by side. First, like both on-prem and online, they are vulnerable to zero-day attacks. And like if zero-day is your main threat, which probably should not be, but in this case it just doesn't matter. They are both. But on-prem also would be vulnerable to end-day attacks. End-day means that there is some amount of time from when security patch was released before you actually applied it to your farm, and n is amount of day. In this case it can be a really high number. Note that SharePoint Online is never vulnerable to end-day attacks because Microsoft they patch SharePoint Online before they release the security patches for everyone else. Also, on-prem is more likely to have some misconfigurations that can lead to a security problem, and it's not that Microsoft doesn't make mistake, but I think it's just less likely. But SharePoint Online will naturally have a wider remote attack surface because, well, obviously it is accessible via internet and there is nothing you can do from that, and you don't have any control over who also may have a tenant in same web application as you do have. And this will expose SharePoint Online to a wide range of cross-tenant attacks. And for on-prem cross-tenant attacks, they should not be an issue because you should not run a multi-tenant on-prem farm. That doesn't make sense. On the positive side, Microsoft with SharePoint Online, they have protection and detection tools available. At least I know for sure that they have an IDS. And these kind of tools, they are usually not available for on-prem deployment. But luckily in on-prem, you have a full control over exposure of your SharePoint web application. So you may decide who have a network access to your application. Is it only your users from your local network, or is it some partners connecting over VPN? So you may keep exposure of your SharePoint web application to a minimum. Well, that's it. Thanks for being with me in this session. And if you have questions, you can once again follow me on Twitter. And you can DM me your questions and I'll be happy to discuss anything around SharePoint security. So let's keep in touch and I hope you will enjoy the rest of Galactic Collaboration Summit.
Thank you for being a part of the Galactic Collaboration Summit. Join the community and meet in-person world-class Microsoft and MVP speakers this autumn in Wiesbaden, Frankfurt, Germany, with 15 full-day tutorials and over 150 Microsoft 365 and Azure sessions at the combined European Collaboration Summit and European Cloud Summit from 26 to 28 October 2020. Community rocks.